It is so nice to be here. I was just sharing as we were all kind of getting ready for the session how much I have appreciated having access to these sessions over the years. Let's begin by talking a little bit about what our objectives are. So what are we going to try to accomplish in the session today? Well, we'll begin really by talking a little around how to use our assessment system, because part of the challenge around providing intensified instruction and interventions, despite small group or whole group, is knowing how to use our data strategically. So we'll begin really by examining that process. And part of what that will lead to is getting us to consider when a small group intervention or a whole group intervention is more appropriate. And so I'm going to challenge you to think about an intervention outside of size. So it's not the size of the grouping that equals the intensity of the intervention, it's specific characteristics or components. So you'll hear me use the terms instead of group size, homogeneous and heterogeneous, to be very specific about how we're going to structure that intervention. And as we get into the conversation around what does it look like to provide an intensified intervention, I have some examples to share with you of what some grouping configurations could be and what some samples of targeted instruction could look like. And we've got two different grade bands to work through as examples. So before we can do any of that work, I'm going to do some backstepping to talk about what we know makes instruction effective and impactful. And so the four subcomponents we're going to talk about related to that are the instructional hierarchy, cognitive load theory. We're going to do a quick drive-by of forms of practice, and then I want to make sure that I leave with you additional resources beyond what I've shared in this PowerPoint, and that's related to the IES practice guide. So if we want to maximize small group instruction, we actually have to do some groundwork first, and that involves making sure that our universal instruction is working. So you've likely heard many people say you cannot intervene your way out of a core problem, and that's true. We usually do not have the human capacity and the scheduling resources available to meet needs of students in small interventions. When we have high proportions of students that are not meeting grade level benchmarks on specific skills, we actually have to back up and address our core or universal instruction first. So if we do that and accomplish that goal of reducing the number of students down to what's manageable for targeted interventions, then we can actually be more intentional and we'll start to see more growth with those interventions. And so a key point to remember as we're working through this process today is that in a small group, we shouldn't find ourselves providing the exact same thing just in a small group setting. If we're genuinely pulling a group of students away from the rest of the classroom to provide instruction within that class setting, it should be because they genuinely need something different from the larger group. So that's where, again, our data is going to be essential in helping us determine that. So if we have a structured problem-solving system that supports us to examine our data and to answer essential questions, then we will be more specific and targeted and intentional. And that will help us reach our goal of mastery. So we're actually going to talk a little bit about mastery and what that means in just a moment. So if these are our goals, what then are we going to use to meet these goals? Well, we're going to use our universal instruction and our universal screener to take more of a proactive and preventative approach. So our universal instruction is really that curriculum-based model. And that curriculum-based model should have a backwards design structure of figuring out what is it that we want students to be able to do and how will we get there. So a well-designed universal instruction resource block curriculum is going to be designed with that, again, proactive and preventative model. Our universal assessment should do the same thing. So our universal assessment should be proactive in that we are measuring the things that we know are essential. We don't want to wait until down the road to say, uh-oh, we should have caught that a student doesn't have good phonemic awareness. We should have known that sooner. So our universal screeners should be aligned with research to identify what are the critical variables that we should be measuring right now for this group of students. And we should also be preventative in that when we have a flag or an indicator that says this child is at risk, we respond to that right away. So that's the proactive and preventative layer, is that universal instruction and that universal assessment. I do want to come back though, even though we're saying universal, which does imply everyone, it doesn't from an instructional perspective mean that in our core instruction, everyone gets the exact same thing. So core should still be somewhat differentiated, and we can come back and revisit that point too in a moment. We then have another layer of our instructional framework, which is our diagnostic and prescriptive layer. And that is also related to curriculum, and it's also related to assessments. So with a curriculum-based model, we're looking at making sure that there are resources and structures available to go backwards and hit those essential skills that a student has not yet mastered. So prerequisite skills should take priority in terms of if we don't clean those prerequisite skills up, we know that the new instruction isn't going to be as impactful and powerful for students. So from a diagnostic perspective too, that means we need assessments that are going to drill down and tell us very specific information about those students and the skills that they may have or they may need us to target. So again, a universal and a diagnostic layer in both assessments and curriculum are an essential part of knowing what to teach and how to teach. So I told you we were going to talk about mastery. And again, if as we're discussing this component today, I pique an interest in you around the research that I'm sharing, these are the researchers that I would direct you towards if this is something that you would like to learn a little bit more about. But if we were all to define mastery, we would probably have some similarities, but we might find that it's really hard to define it in an objective and measurable way. So I want to share with you a quote from the textbook or text, Effective Universal Instruction. And this quote, again, is really a nice, succinct way of explaining why we should know about these stages of mastery. So when we talk about mastery, we're not talking about a student. We're talking about a specific skill that student has with them. And Herring and Eaton back in 1978 sought to define and kind of establish parameters around helping us understand how skills move from new and undeveloped to more advanced and mastery level. So the progression that they outlined starts with acquisition, moves then into fluency. And I would pause to say it's at that fluency stage that most of our assessments are measuring. And so if we stop at that fluency stage because it appears that a student has benchmarked, we may find ourselves a few weeks down the road going, they don't seem to have that skill anymore, but just a couple of weeks ago, it looked pretty good. And now they're looking at me with these big blank eyes as if I've never talked to them about this before. What's going on? That generally reflects that the skill did not actually make it all the way to mastery. So after the fluency stage is generalization. And so in that generalization stage, we have more success at maintaining and supporting students to own that skill and integrate it in more complex ways down the road. But it is that adaptation stage that is true mastery. So our goal is to get specific skills to the adaptation stage in order that the student understands them, can apply them, and will retain them over time. So I'd like to define those stages just a little bit better. And so if we think about, again, how would we know if a skill was in one of these specific stages? So without having any real metrics, I'd like to give you some characteristics that should help define that so that it's recognizable to you. So when students are in the acquisition stage, you might observe that their error rates are pretty high. So a reading example might be, you've just taught the concept of a magic-y syllable. And as a student is reading magic-y words, they may periodically substitute that short vowel sound in when a long vowel sound was appropriate. And so with those high error rates, you may also see that their responses are very slow and effortful. So it's not coming automatic. You might see them having to think through the process. They may even need you to provide visual prompts, like pointing to that E at the end of the word. Or they might need you to prompt them by saying, now, what is that E doing to the vowel in the base word? So you may find that you're having to support them both in error correction and just generally in that retrieval process. So that's acquisition. So acquisition is very clunky. It's going to be the case for a lot of students when a new skill is introduced. We'll know that they've moved into the fluency stage when they're making less errors. So their accuracy is improving, and we might start to see that their automaticity is improving as well. When they do make errors, the errors that they're making may even be things that they are self-correcting, or it may be that it's a very logical error, so confusing things that are similar in structure. We also find at the fluency stage that we're not having to prompt them as much. And so we do want to err on the side of giving less prompts and only providing those for error correction. We'll recognize when a student has moved from fluency to generalization, because not only are they more accurate and automatic, but they're making less errors related to those similar skills. So they can start to distinguish between things like cap and cape pretty easily. And they're applying that skill outside of the context of the lesson. So you might find that some of the words that you were working on in the lesson that were of the same pattern appear in text, and the students are more automatic, but then also words that they have not practiced that utilize that same structure, they're able to successfully read or recognize. And although I'm giving you reading examples, we could do the same thing for spelling. So if, for instance, a student were writing their own text and they wanted to spell a word that is not a word that we had practiced in class, but utilize the same skill that we had been working on, they would be able to spell it accurately. So that generalization stage is really our goal in instruction. And so we need to think about how we're supporting students to make that bridge from what we've taught in a very controlled and structured setting to a more authentic setting. And this is essential because we often find ourselves saying, I'm not really sure why they're doing well in this lesson, but they're not applying it in their work. So it's that application part that we often don't have a very structured and intentional way of supporting. So I want to provide some guidance today around how we could do that. That adaptation stage is unique because this is really something we can't actually teach to. What adaptation is involving is the students being able to integrate many different skills together. So if I take that Magic-E example, and let's say a student is reading connected text and they come across the word fence. And so at the adaptation stage, they would be able to look at that word and go, that's actually not a Magic-E word because there's two consonants between the vowels. Oh, and that C is not going to say k because the E is there to make it say its soft sound. So that's actually a lot of different steps that the student is putting together. So adaptation is integrating lots of skills and successfully applying them. And so again, since we're not actually going to teach those processes, it's that they have to be so accurate and automatic and able to generalize all those individual components, and then we can support them through monitoring and coaching, integrating them. So those are the 4 stages of mastery, which again are really important because as we start to recognize those, then we can make more intentional decisions around lesson design and forms of practice so that we can help students move from one stage to the next. And although these 4 are defined pretty concisely, it's important to note that students may have characteristics of one stage and another. And so there's that bridge that's happening between. So it's not like you're going to jump from one to the other. You might be transitioning. You might also be noticing as you're looking at these descriptions that some of them represent a student who may be stuck in one stage. So you may have worked with a student who's stuck in acquisition on a skill and never quite makes it to fluency, or is stuck in fluency and never quite makes it to generalization. So what I'd like to do next is really look at what might be causing that to happen and how we can support that transition. So that takes us to another important topic, which is cognitive load. So again, as we consider how to help students who might be stuck in one stage make it to the next, we have to really consider what might be going on in their thinking and learning process that's preventing them from moving forward. So these, again, are the researchers that I would point you toward to get a little more information around helping support students to make that progress. So what is cognitive load theory? Well, that term was coined by John Sweller in 2011. But the concept of cognitive load and what our brains can manage as we're learning new information is older than that. And really what it's around is this idea that we all have about the same capacity for our working memory. So there's no real difference between our working memory capacity. And working memory really is the gatekeeper of all learning. So once that working memory capacity is maxed out, then learning is less effective and efficient. So our goal in teaching students is to make sure that we don't exceed their working memory capacity. And the best way to do that is to really understand what takes up the space in working memory. So the essential things that we need to consider if we want to keep that working memory capacity at a manageable level is to figure out if any prerequisite skills have not been mastered. So for example, if I wanted to teach that Magic E lesson to a group of students, and I'm teaching them that Magic E is a syllable type that we can recognize because it contains 2 vowels. And those 2 vowels will be in a very specific order. 1 vowel followed by 1 consonant and an E. And when I recognize that pattern, I'll know how to read that word even if I've never seen it before. The vowel will say its name and that E at the end will be silent. So that's the purpose of the lesson. I want to teach them that information to eventually generalize. But some prerequisite skills that I need to make sure my students have to be successful in that lesson is, can they automatically recognize vowels from consonants? Do they know the concept of vowel sound and vowel name? Are they able to accurately pronounce the consonants and vowels that I will be using in those words? So if any of those prerequisite skills are not in place, then the student's cognitive load is going to be filled up and their working memory capacity will be maxed out because all of the effort that they're exerting is just in recalling and retrieving those prerequisite skills. So that's one of the things that can prevent students from moving forward because their working memory is maxed out, just dealing with the prerequisite skills. Another thing that takes up working memory capacity is when the instruction involves multiple steps. And that's because it's recalling the steps that take center stage and again, consume much of that working memory capacity, leaving little space left for learning. Another thing that kind of compensates and takes up all that space is the demonstration. So if I wanted to teach students and model for them how to identify a Magic E word, and I marked it up a certain way, but then I released them to practice that with a different activity or with different directions, that also takes up that working memory space as they're trying to reconcile the difference. And unclear or unfamiliar directions. So one of the challenges I think that we have now, especially related to unfamiliar directions, is the pressure to gamify instruction. And when we gamify instruction, we often then have to introduce new directions. So new rules, new processes, new procedures, new ways of responding. And when that happens, again, the working memory capacity is taken up by just trying to understand the directions and not on learning and practicing the content. So one thing we need to keep in mind is working memory capacity is limited. And once it's maxed out in the lesson, little learning is happening. Long-term memory, however, is not. So part of our instructional design that we need to consider is how can we reduce the demands on working memory by promoting essential skills to long-term memory. So if we know that we want to not max out working memory, what are some ways that we can address that and meet that objective? Well, the 3 types of load that I want to introduce you to are intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. Germane is the good load. We want that. That's the space that's left over for learning. So our goal is to increase that. So if we think about this image here, which is a cup, and I would challenge us to think about it instead as a funnel, because a funnel would be taking things out of working memory and moving them into long-term memory. And so with a funnel, the rate in which a funnel is draining something depends a lot on how wide or narrow the opening is. So those students who are quick learners and seem to only need 1 or 2 repetitions, I think of them as having this very large funnel. So they're moving things very efficiently into their long-term memory. Whereas the students who need lots of repetitions have a very narrow opening. And so it's going to take a longer period of time for that content to move into long-term memory where they can retrieve it quickly. So what we want to do again is if I know that I'm working with a student who needs lots of repetition, I know that that working memory capacity is pretty limited. It's not going to drain very quickly. So I'm going to keep the two types of load that consume learning space to a bare minimum. How do I do that? Well, I want to reduce intrinsic load. And what intrinsic load is it's the load that the learner brings to the equation. And that is related to, all the prerequisite skills that I might not have. So I can reduce that very nicely by using backward design. So again, it's the idea of what do I want to teach? What are the essential skills that are needed to get there? And that becomes the order of my instruction. And when I do that, then I know that what I'm teaching you today, you are going to have more repetition with it tomorrow because you need it to be able to do tomorrow's skill. So a really well-designed scope and sequence should utilize backward design so that we provide students with ample practice to develop those prerequisite skills. I may also consider using my assessments strategically, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, to reduce intrinsic load. We also want to reduce extraneous load. So think extraneous is extra. It's the extra demands we put on the learner that can shift their attention away from the content and the learning process. And so the way that we reduce extraneous load is really with lesson design. So we want to make sure that we follow a really well-structured part to whole design. So our lesson content should really be working towards priming students for the next step. And so in a structured literacy lesson, that might look like having a visual drill where you practice recalling individual phoneme graphing correspondences, then moving to a larger unit like a blending drill where we work with them in a small but more structured setting. And we might move from there to reading phrases and to reading connected text. So that part to whole design reduces extraneous load because it primes students for learning. Another way we can reduce extraneous load is by having very consistent routines and procedures. And that is both in terms of my language so that I can reduce teacher talk, but also students so that they know what's expected and I don't have to always interject. Today, instead of highlighting, we're going to underline, or on this sheet, we're going to circle. If my routines and procedures are the same, then students can actually focus attention on the content again and not the directions. And then finally, the appropriate forms of practice. So we're going to look at some examples of ways that we can manipulate the design of our practice so that we can, again, make it easier for students when they have high error rates or challenge them when error rates are much lower. So those are ways that we can, again, reduce extraneous and intrinsic load because it's the space that's left over that's accessible to learning new information or applying previously learned information. So again, when you look at this visual, you'll see that the space that's left over is again influenced by how much intrinsic and extraneous load a student is bringing to the learning process. So if we know why kids are getting stuck and we know why they're not moving across these stages, and we have some background into how we can maximize learning for them, what would that actually look like in the context of a classroom? So when we think about interventions, we're going to examine both whole group and small group interventions. And I told you I was going to use these terms, heterogeneous and homogeneous. So we're going to talk both group size, but again, I want us to really be mindful of it's not just the size of the group, but it's the structure of the group that matters. So one reason why we want to be really conservative about our use of small group, so size, which is some students are working with a teacher, a larger group of students are working independently. We want to be conservative about that because of what's happening when students are not working with students. So the quote that you see here from Susan Hall is addressing the cost. And it's not just a cost in terms of human resources, that obviously when we have a small group of students working with one teacher, there's a financial cost to that in terms of other students are not getting support by a teacher. But there's also a time cost because only the students working with the teacher are really getting a lot of return on their investment of being present and engaging in the lesson. Students who are not working with the teacher and working independently are benefiting from practice, but they can only be practicing things that they're already pretty successful with. We don't want students practicing independently things that they have high error rates on. We don't want students practicing things independently that are still clunky and not yet automatic. And so basically when they're working independently, they're in a maintenance stage. So they're not really moving forward. They're just not going backwards in independent practice. So we want to be really careful and make sure that students are not working independently for extended periods of time. So some of the additional costs related to small group instruction is, again, that no matter how well you have designed those stations or independent learning activities, or how much time you spend on the weekends preparing them and cutting them out, they are still not as effective as time with a teacher. So one way where we can reduce that independent time is by utilizing our resources. And that might mean that if there is an additional adult available through a push-in model or through an instructional support staff member, utilizing them during that small group time would be essential. And they can either also be running a group at the same time as the classroom teacher, or they can be available to problem solve if students need help. The challenge is not everyone has that resource available to have another adult in their classroom. So if that's the case, again, we just want to make sure that we are really concentrating that small group time down to a very like 20, 30-minute block of time if possible. So another quote I wanted to share with you also comes from the Effective Universal Instruction book. And it again is just related to the fact that it is a maintenance and not a forward momentum time when students are working independently. And I know that's probably counter to what many of us were trained to do, which was to increase the amount of small group time because it was this differentiation model. And that's true, and that's how we want to use it. But my suggestion is that we might not need as much time with each small group as we think. So as we take a look at some of these models, I want you to note how much time each person or each group is meeting with the teacher. So our goal then would be to increase direct instruction time and decrease independent time. And I have 3 different models to share with you as options to consider. So one option is in model 1, so we may have 1 more support staff member, and that would be great. But in model 1, we would reduce our group to about 20 minutes of small group time. So not 20 minutes per group, 20 minutes for the entire small group block. And so again, that might then be even more efficient if we utilize another staff member so that simultaneously we're each running groups. This model may also work even if you do not have an additional staff member. It just means that you've got 1 teacher running multiple groups at the same time for a total of 20 minutes. And when I share with you the organizational system, I think you'll see how that's possible to accomplish many groups within a 20-minute time. Model 2 is possibly then regrouping students across their grade level. So if I had 2 colleagues in my grade level, we may use assessment data to determine that there are several different groups with similar skill needs, and we can share them across classrooms so that students are pretty homogeneously grouped across the classrooms, and therefore we can meet their needs better instead of spreading ourselves thin across a wide range of skill needs. The challenge with this one is it might make it hard to have as much fluidity in those groupings because it involves a little bit of coordination. It also does increase group size, which isn't a bad idea if, again, the groups have similar needs. It's the homogeneity here that's essential. Model 3, again, is just a variation that can be implemented in both models 1 and 2, which is being very targeted and brief and succinct and skill specific. And that's the one that, again, I'm going to show you as an example that fits within that 20-minute grouping. So in order to be targeted, we have to make sure we're using our assessments strategically. That's a critical component of making sure that interventions are truly intensified and targeted. So I thought it might be helpful to illustrate this with a few different scenarios. So here we have scenario one. So these are students who all completed the same type of universal screening assessment. And in this assessment, typically what classroom teachers may do is look at a composite score. So the overall score of how the students did on specific subtests. So what's interesting is when you look at Lyle's his composite score, it's a 0.21, and that number probably won't mean anything within the context of your assessments. But if I were to describe to you what it means for this scenario, that puts Lyle at risk. So he would be in this red category of being intense risk of being able to do a reading comprehension task on grade level. But what the classroom teacher observed in working with Lyle is that he had great difficulty decoding the passage that he was assessed on. He was putting forth a lot of effort, so this was definitely not an effort issue. He just wasn't getting a lot of return on the investment that he was making. But because he knew so much about the topic that the passage was about, lots of background knowledge on the topic, he was able to answer some comprehension questions pretty well, even though his decoding was problematic. But when I have the teachers break down and look at the actual subtests, we start to get a more complete profile of the student. So the composite was 0.21, but look at his subtest scores. In his decoding subtest, that was the area of need. Language comprehension was not. And so as I flip to the next screen, I want you to see why there would be concern that the three students whose scenarios I'm sharing with you were actually in the same intervention group. So this is Micah. Micah was a little bit lower than Lyle, but again, in terms of their composite score, their overall combination, they were very similar. So they were placed in a group together. But Micah's needs look a little different. So Micah read with almost perfect accuracy, didn't really understand and didn't have background knowledge, but also was really struggling with some of the vocabulary to the point that you could understand based on his responses, he didn't understand what some of those basic words meant. So when I show you Micah's subtest, you'll see that Micah's profile is very different, even though their composite scores were similar. So Micah's issue was more decoding, not language comprehension. But these two students were in the same intervention group. And then finally, we have Jack's. So Jack's composite, again, very similar to the other two students. And Jack's profile is also somewhat different. So his issue was more around complex words. He didn't really have any way of breaking down multisyllabic words or words that had affixes. He also was in a habit of skipping words, guessing words, and didn't comprehend, but it appeared that his comprehension was more related to his inability to decode. So Jack's is kind of has some concerns in both, although we suspected that the comprehension score would have been higher if the decoding challenges weren't present. But again, these three students were in the exact same group because their composite score was used to identify that they had similar needs. So the challenge with a composite score is it's global and it's designed to be global, and we need to use it that way because what it's telling us is how significant is the concern. So by looking at a composite score, a student who has concerns in multiple subtests is definitely going to be a student who will need more intensive support than a child who only has concerns in one subtest. So we do need to look at the composite score holistically, but we can't use the composite score to make recommendations for instructional groupings and targeted interventions. It's just not specific enough. So one of the quotes I wanted to share with you was from Oak Hill, Kane, and Elbrow's text. And what it does is, to me, really succinctly examines why this is a challenge. So since the two components of reading, word recognition, and language comprehension develop at different rates for different students, it's really problematic when our assessments and when our instructional materials keep them coupled together. Especially when you have a child whose language comprehension far exceeds their word recognition skills, or vice versa. So when there are these discrepancies between the two, and we use an assessment that utilizes skill sets in both areas, we probably aren't getting the precise and accurate data that we need. Also, when our instructional materials keep those coupled together, we probably aren't meeting students' needs very well either. We might frustrate them out in word recognition because they can't decode that text, And we might be holding them back in language comprehension because we had to lower the level of the text to be something at their decoding level, whereas they would be able to understand something at a much higher level if we read to them. So that decoupling for assessments and for instruction is an important consideration.
Dr. Peebler.
Yes.
People are wondering what assessment you're using when you're gathering the data that you're providing today.
Right. So that assessment that you just saw me use as an example was a configuration used with an algorithm that replicated like a leveled reader assessment, where the students had to read a passage and answer comprehension questions. And so this was a district created, or I shouldn't say district created, a district adapted assessment. But it is very similar to, again, something that is intended to give a composite reading level of a student. Great question. So when we are using our assessment data, what we want to think through are these 4 steps of questioning processes. And again, these can be very simple. It's not that it has to be a very involved system, but the first question with our composite is who's having difficulty? So when we look at our overall universal screener, it's intended to tell us who's having difficulty. We have to find those students right away. And I think about that as like a smoke alarm going off. So if you're in your home and you smell smoke, you don't wait to see if there's a fire before you get up and do something about it. You smell smoke and you go looking to see, did I leave the burner on? Was it the curling iron? Is the candle too close to the towel? You smell smoke and you go investigate. That's what a universal screener is supposed to do. It's supposed to say this child is at risk, go investigate. It's not supposed to be the fire alarm is going out, call the fire department and leave the house. Like that would be less responsible and proactive. We need to go do some investigating. So then the next question is, now that I found that child or those group of students who are struggling, what specifically are they struggling with? And that often involves either additional informal assessments, or it involves even using some of our observational data from work that they're doing in class. It doesn't always have to be a formal assessment. Once I know what they're struggling with, my next question is, so how am I going to support that? What am I going to do about that? And then that becomes my targeted intervention. And again, my targeted intervention could be a whole group intervention because a lot of students would benefit from that. It could be a small group intervention, but it is a homogeneous intervention. It is something that that group, no matter what size they are, needs that is unique from everyone else. And then the final step is, what will I do to know if what I have implemented is working? So we need to think about progress monitoring, and we need to think about progress monitoring in terms of formative. Did they perform better on the thing that I targeted? That's one question. And also related to progress, and is it having a global outcome? Is it improving them globally as a reader? And so that goes back to often my universal screeners and how I might progress monitor with those universal screening measures because they are normed and global. So that means we have to make sure we have the right tools in place to be able to work through that process. So as you think through your universal screeners, keep in mind this is what they were intended to do. Find the students who are at risk, alert us to trends, either within our grade level, within our classroom, cross grade levels. It should give us a broad picture because it's global of how a student is doing overall as a reader. But then it might also pose more questions that we need to go investigate, either about our core, about our assessments, about our implementation. So that's what a universal screener is intended to do. A diagnostic tool is going to be more skill specific. It's going to tell us where are the skill strengths and where are the areas of difficulty that we'll need to support. It will also tell us about specific patterns. So I might notice that, oh, I've got a child here who a lot of their decoding errors are related to that BD confusion, or there are specific vowels that they're having difficulty with. And so it should alert me to what my next steps are for instruction. It is also going to go more in depth than a universal screener because there should be multiple items on a specific skill. Because I don't want just 1 or 2 items on a skill, because if they get 1, if 2 right, that really doesn't give me an accurate picture of if the skill is developed. And then finally, it's that combination of data points gathered that will help me know, so what's my next step? Where should I intervene? So if you think about the characteristics and the purpose of each type of assessment, it makes it really clear that we really should have some caution around an assessment that claims to be both a universal screener and a diagnostic tool. Since they're intended to serve different purposes and we need them to give us different sets of data and different insights into students and their performance, it would be unlikely that one assessment could accomplish both of those goals. So as you're thinking through your assessments, think about, again, how are we going to use that universal screener? Who is having trouble? What else do I need to know? That will point us to the right diagnostic because there are many diagnostic tools available, and we need to use the right one to identify error patterns. And one really critical point around those error patterns is to make sure that you're looking at the prerequisite skills that that assessment is revealing that could it possibly be explaining why the student isn't hitting grade level benchmarks. So I told you I would come back to that because it's that prerequisite skill piece that also connects to intrinsic load. If my lesson is teaching skills here and the student's prerequisite skills presents a significant gap between what they are able to do and what the lesson is asking them to do, then it's unlikely that they are going to have a lot of capacity left for learning. And so that's why the concept of exposure to grade level curriculum for a lot of students is so problematic, because simply exposing me doesn't mean I'm learning the content, especially if my prerequisite skills are not in place and the lesson is presenting this extraneous load that I can't manage. So that's an important part about why we need to differentiate core. Going back to diagnostics, I really just wanted you to be aware of a slide that is in your handouts, defining some important characteristics of what to look for in an effective diagnostic tool. And again, this comes from Susan Hall's text, 10 Success Factors for Literacy Intervention. So now that we know we need diagnostic tools, and again, not always an assessment, sometimes teacher observation, sometimes classwork, but we need that data to be able to figure out who needs to be grouped together, who has a similar skill need. Because those 3 students that I started with, I told you they were in an intervention group together, and they were in an intervention group based on their composite, but they had very different skill needs. So when I have data that tells me what skills a student needs targeted, and I have insight into, is that skill at the acquisition stage or is it at the fluency stage, then I can design instruction that should help move that student forward. So this is the process that you want to think about building as you're planning your intensification interventions. So again, you're going to start with the universal screener. You're going to figure out underlying factors. Make sure you're isolating variables so that you're getting clean data. So if I want to know if a student can comprehend, I am probably not going to have them read independently because now decoding is a variable. If I want to know if they can decode, I'm going to listen to them read. I'm not going to have them read independently and possibly risk the fact that they correctly guessed a multiple choice question for comprehension. So isolate the variables to get accurate data. So once I know who has similar skill needs, I have to think about intervening. And intervening doesn't really have to do with group size. Intervening has to do with targeting specific skills and being very intentional about how to develop those skills. So sometimes I might be intervening in a large group model. And that would be the case if many students had difficulty with the skill. And how I might intervene is just by providing more targeted practice and additional feedback. If I can address large groups of needs that are similar in a large group setting, I can reduce the amount of time that students are working independently. I don't have to rotate 3 different groups through the teacher table if we're all working on the same skill. We can work on it together in a larger setting, again, if the skill is similar. That will not work, obviously, if the skills are different. One just area to consider around making decisions about, is this a small group need or a large group need, also comes from the effective universal instruction text. So the percentage used here, 60%, we'll talk about, this is not really a hard line. It's just depending on the needs of your group and the resources available. But if less than 60% of your students have mastered a skill, or they're at the stage that you would expect them to be for that skill, it's going to be more efficient if you intervene in a group setting rather than, again, doing multiple groups on that same activity. So what would that look like? Well, this is an example of a composite with some subtests. The composite score has been removed. We're only looking at subtests. And this is just a screener that a school district was using that has components that probably look familiar to you from other universal screeners. So there is a phoneme segmentation subtest. There is a letter naming fluency subtest. There is also a nonsense word fluency, which is really looking at alphabetic principle with 2 separate scores, correct letter sounds and words recoded. There is also a subtest added here, which is phoneme blending. So checking to see, can students blend sounds and produce a word or a syllable? So that's really a nice pre-reading task. So based on this classroom report, we see at the bottom the benchmark percentages. And I would encourage you to look at the benchmark percentages, not to look at the red well below grade level. I include the yellow below grade level with the red, because what yellow typically means is I'm not red yet, but I'm going to be if you don't do something else for me now. So I'm looking at my benchmark percentage. And I do have 3 subtest scores where I have, a lot more than 60% below benchmark. So I have 80 to 85% of my classroom below benchmark. This is definitely going to be something that would be a whole group intervention that is not going to harm the students who are above grade level or have already benchmarked on that score, but it's going to be essential for the students who haven't. Because if I do this in a small group setting, I have increased independent time while kids are working on their own and I'm meeting in small groups. Plus, they probably have similar needs. Now, I won't know that until I drill down and look at what the error patterns are. But at a surface level, it looks like this is a whole group intervention. So if I want to know if they can be addressed in a whole group intervention, I might do some spot checking of data to, again, look at error patterns. I might try doing some whole group intervention and gather observational data to see if there are any outliers. So it probably means that I'm going to need to gather some additional data to see if that is the right decision to improve outcomes. So if I'm suggesting that you can do some interventions in a whole group setting, what then makes an intervention an intervention? So there are critical components of instructional design and delivery that make an intervention effective. And it isn't just about group size. It's actually about the instruction being specialized. So it's about figuring out what the students need and doing that thing, not just a curriculum that's off the shelf. It is specialized based on the data that I have. It's intensive. So being intensive means I am targeting that thing and I'm taking all the other things off the plate. And I am providing likely more practice, massed practice, and lots of prompting and modeling and feedback. And it is intentional. So I have a skill that I'm targeting. I have an instructional activity that I know that is research-based to improve that specific skill. And I've planned out where we're going and how that skill is going to progress. It is consistent because I want to use the same routines and procedures that I've done in my core instruction. I do not want to introduce new routines and procedures, because the moment I do that, again, I've increased extraneous load and I'm now competing with the content that I want them to master. And it is structured. It is probably going to, again, use a systematic part to whole process. And there's going to be a scaffolded approach to scaling back the visual and verbal prompts that I'm offering. So what makes an intervention intensive? It's not really just about group size. It's actually not even just about homogeneity. It's about being very effective and targeted and meeting them where they are. So this is why I need to know what level of mastery they're in, so that I know what I need to manipulate to get them over to that next stage. So this is where I want to pause for a moment and talk about what I was doing in my small group instruction that wasn't as effective as what I do now. When I met with students in a small group and I put them in groupings, generally based on composite, because I was doing that and not drilling down to specific skills, Mostly every group that came to see me at the teacher table got the same lesson. And here's a lot of what that looked like. I might warm them up with a phonemic awareness task. Maybe I extended it into a phonics activity. We might have practiced a specific pattern. We might have read some pattern-based word list. And then I moved them into decodable text, where we practiced reading that decodable text. And I maybe followed up with some comprehension questions. And so that took anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. And then I would send that group back to their seat. I would call another group over. We would warm up with a phonemic awareness or phonics task. We would read a different decodable book. We would work on comprehension tasks. Basically, every single group was getting the same lesson. The only thing different was a little bit of the phonics word work and the passage that we were reading. And in a guided reading level system, it was very much the same structure. So when you reflect on that, what was truly differentiated? Maybe a small part of that lesson based on the phonics skill that they were practicing, but everything else was pretty much the same. That is not an intense intervention. When we want to do an intense intervention, we again have to drill down to specific skills. So when we think about the skills and the sub-skills, a couple of key ideas to keep in mind is separating word recognition and language comprehension. So if I have a student or a group of students that I have pinpointed specific word recognition challenges, I need to think about how I'm going to support that. So that's likely going to work with pattern-based words to target a specific skill that their diagnostic assessment said was an area of need. I would probably use spare and decodable text to practice application of that skill. I might have to back up and work a little more on phonemic awareness or a specific phonics concept in more depth. We might not even be able to read decodable text with that pattern yet. But those are the general concepts for word recognition instruction. For language comprehension, I might use a very different approach in terms of my materials and my lesson. So I will probably, if language comprehension is the concern, I will probably work with text that is much harder than what the students can decode. I'm going to pick something rich in context and vocabulary. I'm likely going to read aloud, do some dialogic reading, break down, and make sure that they're understanding key components of that text. So no matter whether I'm working on word recognition or language comprehension, I'm still going to start by going back and looking at my universal screening data. So I already identified some whole group interventions, and now I'm going to go back and identify the students who look a little different than the rest of my group. Because my benchmark scores in phoneme blending and phoneme segmentation are higher, I want to drill down and look at the students who have not benchmarked in those two areas, especially because these are prerequisite skills for reading and spelling. If I can't segment a word into speech sounds, spelling is going to be hard for me. If I'm struggling to blend phonemes into a syllable, decoding is going to be hard for me. So these are prerequisite skills. The smoke detector's going off. I got to figure out what's going on. So that means I'm going to administer likely an informal diagnostic tool. That's going to pinpoint for me where the area of need is. So this is just an informal blending assessment. And you'll see that it progresses from easier to harder content. So now I know, based on the data that I've gathered on those students, we do have a pretty similar profile. I can put these students together and I can formulate an intervention plan for them. So what I found is that in our phoneme blending group, we are able to blend 2 to 3 phonemes. But anything beyond that, so anything that contained a blend, was not successful for them. They also were making a lot of errors with short vowel sounds in phoneme blending, but they were pretty good with the long vowel sounds because those are easier to distinguish. So again, I've determined based on their error patterns, this is a group that is equally yoked, very homogeneously grouped students, so I can present a lesson that will meet their needs together. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work on phoneme blending of 3 to 4 phonemes. I'm going to hold off on blends for a little while. I'll incorporate them in so I can get that 4 phoneme goal in just a little while. And I'm going to model for them that dragging or continuous phonation. And because they're solid on long vowels, I'm going to start there and get them to do the dragging before I incorporate short vowels. So this is an example of what that grouping might look like. So when I suggested it's possible to do a 20-minute small group time, which would be ideal because now the most amount of time any one student would be working independently is 20 minutes if they're not meeting with me, I can then think through how to maximize that 20 minutes. And if I am skill specific and I have the right data that has truly pinpointed where the areas of needs are, I don't need 15 minutes for each small group because I'm only working on one skill at a time. So if you look at that red box, this is that group I just described to you about phoneme blending. So I am going to pull them over to the table. We're going to spend 5 to 7 minutes. We are only working on phoneme blending. We're not reading a text together. We're not spelling words. We're not doing anything, just phoneme blending. And we're going to do continuous phonation. I'm going to teach them through a very concrete way how to drag the sounds together. I want you to look at the students who are coming over. So I have Ren, Joel, Bailey, Luli, Morgan, Kat, Owen, and Kyle. They're going to come see me for 5 to 7 minutes. We're going to do our task. Everyone else is working independently, and then I'm going to send them away. But take a look at how Luli is actually going to come see me 3 different times. And some of these students are going to see me multiple times because they might have multiple skills that are a concern that I want to target. So this is how we maximize that time by being very laser focused on what it is those students need so that I can move them forward more quickly. I don't have to deliver a full lesson that includes word work and connected text and comprehension because they might not need all those things. So looking at the headings of the different activities in each group, you'll see again that segmentation group that was on my data sheet. And then I also have something at the very bottom that wasn't even on my data collection because this is something I observed in classroom instruction. I have some students who are not really understanding the text that we're working on because they have a syntactic awareness difficulty of identifying who the sentence is about and what they did or what they do. So we have a task to work on with them. And then I have a handwriting intervention group because it feels like every year I have a handwriting intervention group. So again, these rotations are brief, about 5 to 7 minutes each. So as I'm designing and delivering those interventions, what I have to think about is I need to be prescriptive. And the only way I can be very prescriptive and individualized is if I have the right data to tell me what it is that student or group of students needs. And to reduce extending their working memory capacity and overloading them, I have to be very explicit. We're going to do a lot of I do, we do, you do. My routines and my procedures that I do in my intervention are going to mirror what I do in my core, because the more fragile the learning environment is for a student, the less successful they will be with me always changing the activities and the routines and procedures. So there should be a lot of consistency across tiers. And I'm going to give very concrete examples, and I'm going to gradually reduce the prompts, the visual and verbal prompts. So the other piece of making an intervention intensive is incorporating research on practice. So I want you to notice as we work through the next couple of slides, the different format of practice opportunities in these interventions. So blocked and masked content. So you'll see what blocked looks like. But masked means concentrated practice in a short period of time. That's really helpful when the content is new and I'm in that acquisition stage. Once I have my accuracy rates high and my automaticity rates are continuing to get higher, then I want to start making sure that you don't forget what you worked so hard to learn. So then I'm going to move to spaced practice. And spaced or distributed practice would be best described by spreading practice out over time. So it's incorporating a couple of days off with the task and then visiting it again, and a couple more days off and visiting it again. So it's that time over, that practice over time that prevents forgetting. And then you'll see what interleaving looks like. So masked and spaced are about timing and frequency, whereas blocked and interleaved are about visual presentation. So here is back to that group. We're going to talk about that phonics group now. So this phonics group is struggling with getting their short vowel sounds nice and clean. So we're going to target that skill first with a blocked list. So what makes this blocked is you can look down each column And you can see that each column contains the same short vowel sound. And this creates, again, less distraction. It's more supportive, especially when students are in the acquisition stage and error rates are high. So what that might look like is highlighting the vowel in each column, and the students would say, and then they would read the word had, tax, rag, map. So blocked practice, great in the acquisition stage. And again, they would repeat that for each of those vowels. After their accuracy is high, then I want to shift to an interleaved list. And in an interleaved list, you'll notice no longer can I look down the column and see the same vowel sound. They're all mixed together. So if students are able to continue to read accurately and automatically in this less supportive format where the content is mixed up, then I know I'm getting them closer to generalization. But if I kept them in a blocked list for too long, I might get a false sense of security that they know that skill. And really what they did is they got on autopilot. So this interleaved is a way of, again, scaffolding supports so that I am reducing the support by increasing the difficulty. This is the type of practice you want to consider offering a student towards the end of the fluency stage to support them from fluency to generalization. This is an example of that same type of grouping format, but now we're looking at an older range of students. So we have here students who are maybe second, third grade, and we've got a group that our diagnostic data indicated that they were having trouble with a specific syllable division pattern for reading multisyllabic words. So what I might do for that group of students, I'll show you on the next couple of slides. But again, if you could just skim down column 1 under Monday and see that some students are engaging in instruction at the teacher table more than one time during that 20-minute rotation. So back to cognitive load. If I know that I want to work on syllable division of BCV, as a teacher, I know that means we're going to be working with open and closed syllables. I should start by reviewing what open and closed syllables are to make sure that those prerequisite skills are solid. And if in doing that, I determine that they are not solid, that becomes the priority of instruction. I can't move on and work on application in 2-syllable words if they don't have these prerequisite skills. And again, that's part of why we have to be really careful about taxing students' cognitive load and teaching them here when the skills are not ready to support that higher level application and backing up where we need to be. So once I've reviewed, then I can give the direct instruction on, how we would approach a word that had a division pattern that had a single consonant between 2 vowels, and how then we would figure out how to flex and divide after the consonant and what would that sound like versus after the vowel and what that would sound like. And again, that would just be the focus, 5 to 7 minutes every day throughout the course of the week, supporting them to engage in the task with less prompts from me as the teacher to get to accuracy, automaticity, and eventually generalization. When I'm planning my small group instruction, I always keep in mind that this is what I'm planning this week, but what am I going to do next if they should meet this goal sooner than I thought? So if I have a group of students that somehow by Wednesday they mastered that skill, are they ready to move on to something else? Or is there another group ready in queue that can take their place? Another example of intensification and maximizing that small group time. I have a group of students that I can tell they're having difficulty with language comprehension because they're losing track of pronoun antecedent reference in text. So the author's use of pronouns is causing them to trip up over tracking who is it about and what did they do. So again, back up, check prerequisite skills. Are they understanding what the job of a pronoun is? It takes the place of the noun. Are they successfully recognizing singular and plural pronouns? Do they understand object pronouns? Because I want to eventually support them to do this in a generalized setting. So this is where I want them to go. I want them to understand when they read a connected text passage or when I read one to them, how their understanding of pronouns will support them to make meaning. So again, I want to make sure that they understand an author takes a noun occasionally and might replace it with a pronoun so they don't have to repeat the plant over and over again. And in this passage, the author does that quite a bit. So instead of saying the plant, what pronoun could I put in place of the plant in this sentence? The plant is tall. And that would be part of our small group 5 to 7 minute intervention. It is tall. So this type of task might be what we do on Monday, with the goal of towards the end of the week engaging in this, where I read to them. And when I throw my hand out, they tell me what noun the pronoun replaced. So if I skip down a couple of sentences, that might look like this. Some plants fell into swamps when they died. So they is another name for, and they would tell me the plants. Okay, good. Their remains. Whose remains? The plant's remains were buried under layers of mud. So again, thinking through in that cognitive load model, how am I going to build them up so that they can take that skill and eventually get to generalization? And that means, that structured, scaffolded process with the supports and the consistent routines and procedures that they then can use to recall and retrieve concepts on their own. And there is one more example related to my syntactic awareness group with morphology. They were having a really hard time with derivational suffixes and inflected endings and understanding how that changed the meaning of the word. So my goal with them was to review the meanings of the different suffixes, and then we might work through really a blocked list in column 1 where we are just changing the suffix and we are talking through and figuring out how changing the suffix slightly changes the meaning of the word. So to recap, before I open it up for questions, so again, when we're doing this data-driven decision-making process to target interventions, we have to think about meeting students' specific needs. And when we meet their needs, we'll find that the groupings become very flexible. So we are not in a group for an extended period of time. I might be with a student that I typically am not with in an intervention because we happen to have the same need that week or those couple of weeks. So we have to then have a process of using our universal instruction and our universal assessments. We have to think about how we're doing our interventions, what's going to be best done in a whole group setting, what's going to be best done in a small group setting. So when we have that structure in place, then we can be very targeted. And when we're targeted and we take into consideration the stages of mastery and cognitive load and forms of practice, we'll start to see that we are more successful moving kids through skill-specific challenges in a more efficient way. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can do some questions. And then again, as you're accessing the slides, know that the resources that I've cited are linked in as well as some examples. So